would say that my interest in mythology, in story, in fable, in allegory is an old one. It's not something that I go to because I'm looking at a particular question or a particular concern, but that it is my way of looking at things. Nilkant is made in 2000. It starts from a very simple everyday life experience. The city was extremely polluted. Delhi is a little better now. The air pollution at that time was terrible. And every time I left the city and I came back, I would immediately have a powerful allergic reaction. So, following the question of poison, reading homeopathic texts, those lead me to alchemical texts and to a number of myths and stories about poison. Looking also at poison as not just physical, but also psychic, psychological, the toxicity of social relations that are produced by certain conditions. And then, of course, is the extraordinary myth of Nilkant. It's a very well-known story. It's something that is popular, represented in calendars, still alive. It's an allegory of how the desire of the gods to become immortal, because the gods are not immortal and they seek amrit, which is nectar, the elixir of immortality. They can't extract it on their own, so they team up with the demons. And in the beginning, as they churn the cosmic ocean, the story goes, all these wondrous things appear. The wish-fulfilling cow and the star of plenty, but no elixir of immortality. And as they continue to churn, the ocean begins to heave and spit and boil, and everything starts, the plants, the animals, everything starts pouring into this water which is now boiling, and what they have actually produced is this terrible poison. And it's a poison that can destroy time itself. It threatens to destroy the entire universe, not just Earth. Shiva is the god who has been aloof from this process. He is moved by compassion for the fate of the Earth and opens his mouth and takes this poison in, which is why he's called Nilkant, which means blue throat, because even he cannot take it in fully into his body. He holds it in his throat. So he's able to contain the poison, and you're left with the question of the transformation of poison. So I use this myth as an allegory for our situation in the modern Indian city, and perhaps it's not just the Indian city, but the contemporary city in many, many situations where greed has generated a kind of poison, a poison which affects all the senses, and going beyond the material, sensorial poisoning to other levels of poisoning, to open up this question of transformation and of containment. And I almost ask whether each one of us is unwittingly a kind of Nilkant, where we are absorbing and holding this poison within us, and how do we find means of transformation? So what you see when you walk into the installation, which is a really large piece, it's floor-based, it's about 25 square feet, and you're looking down at what looks like a miniature city. It's made up of 260 little aluminium light boxes. It's arranged in a form which draws from the mandala, and you walk into it, so you're drawn towards the center. Each of these aluminium towers carries an image of one of the senses. The 5 senses are associated with the 5 elements. So you have this strange feeling of going through these fragmented body parts, but rearranged. So there's a kind of tension between the fragmentation and the re-harmonizing. In the 4 corners, which are in a sense the gates to the mandala, as the classical mandala always has gates, you see images which have been created in the biggest dumps of Delhi, the landfills. This is Ghazipur, and they're treated like British colonial landscapes. So these are large backlit images where you see a kind of almost romantic rendition of landscape, but what you're looking at is garbage. As you come into the center, you're looking down on this video where images from the land site are projected onto this monumental throat, which struggles to ingest, to swallow, sometimes regurgitating, sometimes managing. It's this kind of very, very concentrated, tiny movement. It's clearly a visceral bodily movement, but you're not even sure that it's a throat. It takes some time to understand that. So the installation tries to provoke the viewer into thinking about the nature of nectar and poison, and whether in our search for nectar we have not generated poison, and what do we do now with the poison? Can we transform it into nectar? I continuously go back to the river, but then I went back to work on this public art project, Project Y, which was a conversation between the River Elbe in Hamburg and the Yamuna here, curated by Ravi Agarwal, friend and eco-activist. I went back to the river and took a boat out, and I really sank into despair. She was black, I could barely breathe, I had wheezing, the methane coming off the river was practically inflammable. I actually went into a state of grave doubt about the meaning of what I was doing, of the thinking, of the belief and the desire to make interventions to basically open up public consciousness, because the city has turned its back on the river. And this project was very much about trying to once again forge a connection, to try and get people to come physically to the site, to come to the river, etc. I really felt that it was almost too late, that nothing was possible. It was a state of great despair. Out of that despair, I felt the only thing I could do was to actually present a dystopia. A futuristic vision which was actually extremely close. It wasn't some faraway future. And in that sense, to confront the city, and particularly the planners, and the people who were responsible for this continuing situation, as well as the ordinary citizens who just didn't seem to care, with what actually would happen. From that came this idea of the water becoming fire, the river bursting into flame. This has been known to happen. When rivers reach a certain level of toxicity, they can catch fire. It's also a kind of prophecy that when one of the key elements transmutes into the other, it is an apocalyptic moment. So when water becomes fire. The work itself draws, ironically, on a very beautiful hymn of praise, a 14th century text that is still sung every morning all along the banks of the Yamuna, in Delhi, in Mathura, in Vrindavan, where she is described as this beautiful, sensual woman. Her banks are wide, generous hips. The spray of water are the diamonds in the jewels she wears. Her banks are fragrant with flowering trees, her companions are the birds, etc. It's a very beautiful, rather flowery hymn of praise, and almost each element that is described becomes extremely ironical when you think of it in terms of the river today. Somewhere the body, the material body of the goddess, which is the river, has gotten disconnected from the divine body, the worship body. So the goddess Yamuna continues to be worshipped. The detritus of that worship is thrown into her material body. This disjuncture, this rupture between the living body of the goddess and the abstracted body is, I think, one of the core disturbances in the fact that there is no continuum between these embedded ecological ideas which are wound up with culture and with religion. So in Black Waters Will Burn, You come to the site, which is an edge of the river, a site that is loaded historically because it was where a very large community of people lived for more than 100 years, who were brutally bulldozed and thrown out of the area. It was the Yamuna Pushta colony, where more than 1 lakh people were displaced in this attempt to clean up the banks of the river, to pretty it up for the Commonwealth Games. That site is now the site of an art project. It is also a park, which is a fairly abandoned park because there's very little access. When you come into the place, you see this ramp made out of gunny bags filled with sand, on which you are invited to climb. Painted onto this ramp is excerpts from the 14th century hymn to the Yamuna Ashtakam. And so you're actually walking on this text, you're stamping on it as you go. In Indian tradition, you never walk on words, and if your foot accidentally touches a book, you actually lift the book up to your head saying, I have inadvertently offended wisdom. So here you are deliberately being asked to walk on what is a sacred text. People walk on this text and they slowly rise, and when they come to the height, they are looking down to this very, very large object which is floating on the water. It is a female form. It could be a seed, it could be a yoni, which is a vaginal form, it could be a riverine form, some kind of sea creature, water creature, aquatic form. It evokes all of these, but it's not either one or the other, so it's an abstract form. The form is wrapped in white bandages. It is a wounded female form, and as she floats in the water over the days, a lot of the detritus of the Yamuna gathers around her, so she acquires a kind of garland of garbage, including a dead dog, including all kinds of things. This is quite intentional because I know that this will happen, and the white slowly gets muddied and dirtied and stained. As dusk falls, a projection comes up where the form itself seems to catch fire and slowly dissolves into flame. What I'm doing is really looking at what's happening to water and to the river from the perspective of women who struggle and survive in this city. So the first image is it's an image which was manipulated based on several documentary images of the effluent of the river Yamuna. There's this white froth which looks very nice, and it's actually sheer poison. So you have moving across that image of the poisoned river, which is rendered as a kind of quite elaborate, natural but slightly surreal riverscape, are these taps, empty taps, dry taps, which become almost inimical in the sense that they determine the ordinary woman's life, from waking up at 4 in the morning for municipal water supply that will come for 15 minutes, the battles that happen at the water line where the people actually get into fights, etc. It's quite brutalized, this collection of water. So the tap becomes a metaphor for that accessing of water for daily needs, juxtaposed with the poisoned river, where there is water, but the river has been turned into a drain. It is highly contaminated. The next image is of a landfill, and what moves across it is a grid of the city. A witness, you see her from behind, someone who is watching the process of the grid taking over the city, and what it generates is in fact a conversion of land into landfill. So you have garbage turning into land, you have the grid of the city, which seems to offer some sort of fantasy of another city, a metropolis, which makes complete sense on the planner's drawing board, but the way it's actually inhabited is completely different. This is a woman who was thrown out of the place she occupied, which was under a tree, a little hut on the banks of the river. And she is holding a set of papers. It's ironic because the papers are identity papers which prove that she's a sadhu. Sadhus are people who step out of normal society to take on a completely extra social identity. Yet this proves via the state that she is a bona fide extra social being, and she is moving across another part of the river where the old steps and ghats which lead you down to the river. So she moves across that part of the river where you see those structures, and you see in fact the huge amounts of garbage that have gathered and the kind of plastic waste that is forming new kinds of banks and new forms of steps. So the three together make a statement about displacement, about the marginal figure of women within today's hyper-urbanization, and the witnessing of that again from a feminine perspective. So it combines two key concerns of mine, which is ecology, urban ecologies, and feminism. In 2008, there was a very rich opportunity in the shape of a public art project called 48 Degrees. The invitation was really to work with the city, with certain sites within the city. So I was walking with these architects in several sites that interested me, mostly in Old Delhi. And as we're passing, I just noticed this plaque saying swimming pool. And this is the very noisy, crowded road in front of the railway station. It's a chaotic and crazy road, and I thought, swimming pool here, what is it? And I look up, and it's the Delhi Public Library. So I went in immediately and asked about the swimming pool. They said, yes, it's actually, obviously there's no swimming pool anymore, it's a basement storage. And I tuck into this place and I am completely blown away by what I see. There's this lion's head bulging out of the side of the wall, choked with newspapers. There's clearly a fountain that used to run, and the whole space slopes down about 60 feet. This is the ex-swimming pool, which has been turned into basically a dump. The next time we went back to talk to them about permissions, this had been boarded over. They had hammered pieces of wood so that no one could enter. And there was a big crisis because they were worried that some journalist would say that they're not taking care of things, and because it was a dump and it had this gorgeous quality of a ruin. It was the books, it was the fountain, it was the sense that the knowledge which was new to me, that busy, crazy street we had just come off was actually a waterway, and not so long ago, just 100 years ago. So from this sense of this street being a water canal, I had this sense of wanting to really recover the memories of water that lay just beneath the surface of the city. And the city as we see it now, holding subterranean memories, relationships to water, actual structures to do with water that had gotten completely erased. And that recovering this could be a way of also recovering a personal and cultural link to water itself. We've all been turned into beleaguered consumers where we just desperately need water to fulfill our daily needs, and water has become a commodity and in a sense evacuated of its larger meanings, both culturally and personally and psychically. So the idea of the divining rod, of the dowsing for the memory of water in the city of Delhi, grew out of that, and that's why the work is titled The Water Diviner, wherein each viewer is invited to become a dowser of this memory. The whole space is saturated in a deep blue light. As you enter, you yourself become blue, so you have this sense of being underwater, subaqueous, somewhere entering a space which is fictional, surreal, not quite real, and yet grounded in history. The books, I added something like 6 or 8 truckloads, so I basically took all of this and sculpted the books into sort of wave-like forms, big, large cascades, build them up to the ceiling where they were tumbling down, moving across the space. The books are all tied into bundles, and the bundles actually create the kind of structural unit to build these massive sort of structures out of the books. Tucked amongst these are the illuminated books. These bring together images drawn from classical painting, which refer to the Mughal and pre-Mughal period, describing riverine culture. These images are tropes. They are these classic figures, the lovers, the ascetic, the woman musician. They are tropes which are reproduced and reenacted in popular culture, so are familiar. The stories that they tell, which are mainly from the Krishna cult, which is most tied to the Yamuna, and the stories about the Yamuna, who is a goddess as well as a river, and she is the lover of Krishna, are woven into these. And I have for a long time been struck by forms of what I think of as eco-philosophy that lie embedded in these tales. Through years of retelling and through mechanized ritual worship, the original meaning and the original intent of these stories has often gotten completely left out, where people will perhaps mechanically reenact certain elements in the ritual worship of these gods, but having forgotten the originary purpose, which to me are actually fairly profound commentaries on the relationship between the earth, the natural world, water, and human beings. So in these images, what I do is collage, juxtapose, weave them together with the absolutely dire situation of the river today. So you have the classic image of the women, the gopis, bathing in the river. It is an image of great sensuality, but the river herself is full of plastic, garbage, the kind of material that we're actually putting into the river today. So it becomes a shocking image, particularly shocking for people who are very familiar with the original image and have never brought the two together in their minds, because the divinized image remains separated from the material reality of the river. There are a number of such stories, fables, images that I recuperate and bring into a contemporary reading. There's another story which relates to Balram, who is the brother of Krishna. He desires Yamuna, but Yamuna prefers Krishna. He is a farmer and Krishna is a cowherd. So one day Balram has been drinking and is hot and wants to cool off. So he's in this forest grove and he yells out to the river and says, "Come here and cool me down." And she's offended, she's a goddess, and says, "If you wish to bathe, come to the river and bathe." And he pulls out his plow, he's always represented with his plow, and begins to drag the river towards him. The image is of dragging a woman by her hair. And she begins to break into thousands of tiny little rivulets, little streams. So she acquiesces and comes and floods the grove in which she's sitting. This could be the first dam in mythological history. I juxtapose this with a satellite image of the dam at Dakpathar, which is the first dam on the river Yamuna when she leaves her source in the mountains. In the animated, the moving image, illuminated books that you see, you have the story retold with a moving layer which adds another dimension to this recuperation of the story into contemporary times. You see this woman musician sitting on the banks of the river, singing. The banks, of course, are no longer the banks beautifully rendered in the painting tradition, but are the banks of today. And next to her is a story, which is a story that I find very beautiful. Narad Muni, who's an interesting trickster figure in Indian mythology, has been on one of his visits to heaven and is coming back to earth, and on the way he sees these beautiful creatures. But each one of them is maimed in some way, and he says, "Who are you, and what manner of being are you, and what happened to you?" So they say, "We are the notes, we are the swaras, the notes of music." And he says, "And what happened to you?" And they say that every time a musician sings out of key, this is what happens. He grows greatly ashamed and embarrassed because he sings himself and he has often sung out of key. And to think that this is what it means. So he says, "What will heal you?" So they say, the perfect song sung by the perfect singer. Now, who could this be? He goes to the various gods, and Shiva agrees to sing the perfect song, but he says, "I can only sing if I have the perfect listener." So Brahma agrees to be the perfect listener, and Shiva sings. Brahma is so moved by the music that he dissolves into water, which becomes the river that comes down to earth. It's a beautiful story, and I find it particularly poignant because it speaks of such a nuanced understanding of sound. What you find moving across this story is statistics of sound pollution, which map what is actually happening in the heart of this culture, which has such an evolved sense of sound. Across the Ragini figure move these tiny elements, which initially you wonder what they are, and when you look closely, you realize that they're loudspeakers. So it's bringing these stories in relation with what is happening now. It is collapsing time, and one of the things that the installation does is actually create simultaneous evocations of multiple periods of the past, the present, and possibly the future. The figure of the elephant in water was something that somehow kept appearing in my mind every time I thought of that space. And the elephant is both the keeper of memory and represents a kind of, for me, a collective wisdom. There is very rich literature, both mythological and biological or zoological, about elephants and about certain kinds of qualities of collaboration, of memory keeping, of forms of communication, which I think are very significant to us, and perhaps that's why the elephant is divinized within South Asian culture. Encountering a body that you expect to be very large and heavy, somehow weightless in the water, evokes a very visceral response, which is hard to put into words. And as you watch the elephant, which is within the water, there is, for me, a great sense of the sensuality of water, of the weightlessness of water, harking back perhaps to childhood memories, to older memories of even swimming in the river, which if you speak to older inhabitants of the city, they remember actually swimming in the Yamuna, something that no one would contemplate doing now unless they, it's certain death. The elephant is in the water, implodes and becomes a kind of tiny unit, almost like a molecule, perhaps the smallest bit of matter, which is also the smallest particle of light, and then reforms, and only to repeat the cycle of dissolution, recovery, dissolution. For me, the entire work is about the recovery of cultural memory and about how important that is to produce genuinely ecological behavior. We have forgotten this very deep, intimate, loving relationship with nature that we actually have and which is richly embodied in our culture.